So in our last video, we talked about how homeopathy is the type of medicine that addresses susceptibility, which is ultimately the root cause of illness, and specifically in PANS and PANDAS. It explains why we have an atypical response to infections or other things that trigger an immune response. And so homeopathy is what addresses it, and there's probably questions about what homeopathy actually is. Before we even get started, because I'm going to share with you some things about homeopathy that are probably going to sound a little bit like a stretch for the imagination. I'm going to acknowledge up front that I was and still am in many ways a skeptic of homeopathy, and yet I have seen it work both for me personally and with thousands, literally thousands of families that are recovering from PANS using homeopathy alone. And so the scientist in me, because my background over here, you can see, my background is in physiology and neurobiology from the University of Maryland before I went into naturopathic medical school. And so homeopathy, the reason it's so hard for me to wrap my head around still is homeopathy is made from single substances found in nature that are prepared in an ultra dilute way, very, very dilute. When I first started in naturopathic medical school, we didn't have the research that I'm going to share with you here in a minute. That when I first started, we just knew that it was so dilute that it was dilute beyond the point of Avogadro's number, which is 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd, which means that there is basically nothing left in these substances. So when I was first introduced to homeopathy in naturopathic medical school, I was flabbergasted. I thought it was quackery. I almost quit naturopathic medical school because if this was part of the required curriculum, then it made me call into question the validity of everything else in the program. I had made a decision to go ahead and set it aside because I was like, okay, they want to tell me I'm going to give people nothing and hope that that's going to make them better. Whatever, I'm going to take the good and I'll like put the bad aside and I'm just move forward, until I was in the position that my conventional psychiatrist made a recommendation to me that made no sense. And I was given the opportunity to give homeopathy a try, and it worked so effectively, significantly better than anything else I'd ever used for my condition. And I was actually starting to heal, and I was sold. I had the experience. I had that homeopathy magic moment where I saw what it was possible that homeopathy could do, and I had to learn how to use it with people. I still to this day am very skeptical because they are very dilute forms of medicine. Luckily, since I have graduated, there has been some research that has shown that there are nanoparticles that are actually formed, because homeopathy is made in a process where we do what's called serial dilution and succussion. So we dilute in a serial way. So basically 1 drop of the substance in 99 drops of water, and then 1 drop from that bottle into another 99 drops of water, and then 1 drop from that bottle into another 99 drops of water. But it's agitated or succussed between each time the dilution is made. And it's been found that, one, it doesn't work if you don't do the succussion between. And the reason that we understand that now is because nanoparticles are formed. So some people are actually saying homeopathy was the original nanomedicine. Now that we have this evidence that nanoparticles are formed in the process of making the homeopathic remedies. So all of this to say is I was a big skeptic. I'm glad that I'm learning more about what is actually the homeopathic remedies. And I'm excited to learn more about how they work in the body. We have since learned that those nanoparticles do bind at the cellular level, and we're still learning what happens then beyond, because homeopathy is a system of medicine that works for the entire person. And so it's still confusing about how you can bind at the cellular level and have impacts on the gut, the GI function, and mental and behavioral health, and headaches, and skin, and everything. But at the same time, it makes sense because everything is connected, right? And so why would you have the inability for those things, for something to impact everything? So I'm going to go back a little bit and I'll tell you just a little bit about homeopathy and how it was discovered, give you just a brief history, because I do think it helps people to understand a little bit more about it, and then describe to you what classical homeopathy or classical Hahnemannian homeopathy is. Also tell you a little bit about what homeopathy isn't, a tiny bit about how it works or what we understand, from how it works, and then let Jody give you some insights that she had her own personal journey to homeopathy, because she also was a skeptic. And in fact, as a younger person, had an introduction to homeopathy that she just completely blew off, right? So homeopathy was discovered in over 200 years ago, late 17, early 1800s, by a doctor named Samuel Hahnemann. This was at the time when medications that were being used were basically like pure arsenic, mercury, bloodletting. He was wise enough to recognize that he was doing more harm than good. So he closed his practice and decided to make a living for his family by translating medical texts, because he happened to just be a really smart guy and had done a lot of research and knew several languages. In doing the medical text translation, he translated one text from Hippocrates that had this concept of like cures like. It's sort of tucked away in the back of his brain, moved on, was translating another text, and he came to this, this materia medica about a particular herb that was really useful for curing malaria. It's called the cinchona bark. And one of the things that the person who wrote this book had proposed was that the bitter properties of the cinchona bark were why it was so effective in curing malaria. Well, having done lots of translation and lots of research, Hahnemann knew that there were other plants that had far more bitter properties than cinchona bark did, and was very curious. And so for some reason, he decided to take cinchona bark himself, take some tinctures of it, and he ended up having symptoms like malaria. He had the tidal fevers and all the things that typically come with malaria. And the light bulb went off, 2 and 2 put together, and he realized that that concept of like cures like was what he had just experienced, that he had just taken something that as a healthy person caused symptoms that looked like malaria for a plant that is well known to actually treat malaria. So he started doing some experimenting to see if there was any other stuff that he could find that had the same effect. And he found repeatedly that when he gave something to a healthy person, it caused symptoms that it was known to also be able to use to treat in somebody who was unhealthy. So that like cures like concept repeated over and over again and bore out in his experiments. He then went on and started doing some work with patients again, using this concept, and found more and more that it was really, really effective. He was using a lot of crude doses early on, though, and the substances that he was using were really, really toxic, which is why he started diluting them. So this was out of safety, out of precaution for both the healthy people he was testing substances on to see if it caused those symptoms, and to have as little impact as possible on the people he was trying to help cure from the conditions that they were struggling with. And it was almost an oop that he found out that the more dilute something was, the more effective it was and safer it was, in that it still had the efficacy of helping to stimulate that healing principle and that healing process in the body without causing the significant side effects. And so out of, pure luck, we found out that using very dilute medicines can actually still be quite effective and useful for curing disease. So that's how homeopathy was really found. There have been since lots of different people who are trying to continue to improve upon or refine the process of homeopathy, but it's not not something that stood the test of time and has gone through that rigorous amount of research and historical use and clinical verification that we see in classical Hahnemannian homeopathy. And so when I talk about homeopathy, or any of the providers at Resilience Naturopathic talk about homeopathy, we are talking about classical Hahnemannian homeopathy, which means one single medicine at a time, recommended on this concept of like cures like, so symptoms that could cause similar symptoms in a healthy person that you're experiencing in your unhealthy state, and at the minimum dose possible. And so we're using very dilute medicines, a single substance, one at a time, not one forever where you have to meet you where you're at, but one single medicine at a time to move that body closer to that point of healing. We'll talk a little bit more about what the healing journey looks like in a future video. But I wanted to make sure we just touched on that concept right up front, that classical Hahnemannian homeopathy being a single remedy at a time. Anything you want to add in here, Jody, with your skepticism or your understanding, and how like the history made any difference for you? If not, that's totally fine. We can move on to what isn't homeopathy.
I'm just sitting here thinking that I'm like reading mom's minds right now,
Hmm.
and I still don't understand all of this. And, and,
Yeah.
and so these are all things that are really hard to wrap your brain around. But I will say, the more I let go of the need to understand it, I think that's the beautiful thing about homeopathy is I think there's so many of us that start homeopathy extremely skeptical and not quite
Hmm.
understanding, and then you get in it and you see that first little change or that first improvement of a symptom, or even, for some people, a bigger shift and an
Hmm.
overall improvement. And then you're like, "Ooh, like homeopathy is the only thing that I changed. That is the only thing that could have produced what just happened." And so I think it's okay to be skeptical. It's okay to not understand all of this. It will start to make sense the more you get into it, because it's a lot to wrap our brains around. It's not what, we didn't grow up learning how to treat ourselves or our
Hmm.
children in this manner. It's very different, and so it takes a little bit to get used to it. You're just not going to 100% understand it in the before, in the beginning, in the middle, and I'm all the way through it. I don't fully understand it, and my daughter's recovered. We just
I'm a doctor and I had to let go
Yeah.
of understanding like the mechanism of action, right? Because I'm hopeful that by the time I retire, we will understand exactly what happened. And I'm so excited every time we get one step further with understanding of nanoparticles, having evidence, microscopic evidence that it actually is binding at the cellular level and creating cellular change and cellular adaptation. I'm excited every time I see something like that. And I had to let it go because the reality is, I'm not a researcher. I'm somebody who wants to help people recover. And I had to understand that my job is not necessarily to understand exactly how it works, but to understand the concepts of what's happening in the body and then how to apply it so that I can help people get to that point of recovery. So that's where I had to get to. So
Yep.
I'm going to touch a little bit on what homeopathy isn't, then we'll touch a little bit on what that concept about how homeopathy works, or like the metaphors for how homeopathy works, and then we'll move on to our next video. So what we probably already got this point across because I described what homeopathy is, but it's really important to recognize homeopathy isn't. So homeopathy isn't herbs, although homeopathic remedies can be made from herbs. Homeopathy isn't supplements, although homeopathy can be made from nutrients. So homeopathy is typically made from plant, mineral, or animal sources, and occasionally from biological tissues as well. Um, Homeopathy is not isopathy, which is similar in that they are using those ultra dilute prepared medicines. Typically, they're made from nosodes, which are made from basically the pathological process in itself. So, for instance, when we're talking about pandas, some people would think they would give the strep nosode because it's the cause, almost like a almost a similar concept to the way people think of vaccines, where you give the thing that is actually the cause to try and prevent the cause. It doesn't work that way. It's not the exact same thing. So apathy is not prescribed in that same way. It's that it still has to be on that concept of like cures like. And then similarly, LDI or low dose immunotherapy, or LDA, low dose antigen therapy, also has some similarities with homeopathy in how they're prepared, how the substances that are used are prepared, but how they are prescribed is really what makes the difference, what makes something homeopathic versus isopathic or the LDI or LDA, where you're really still focused on that thing that we talked about in the last video that is not the issue, which is the pathogen itself. That's not the issue, it's the susceptibility. And so when we're focusing on using something like LDI, LDA, or nosodes and isopathy, we sometimes get confused, think we're using homeopathy, but we're not, because they're not being used, not being prescribed in that homeopathic way, on that concept of like cures like. Um, and so the reason that that makes a difference, it's not just about the substance and the being ultra dilute and how it's prepared. It's about how it is used. It's about how it's prescribed that makes that difference to actually address susceptibility. You can see some improvements for people using these things in these other ways, but they tend to be palliative. They don't get to that place of full recovery and full healing because it's still focusing on the wrong thing. It's focusing on a pathogen. It's not focusing on the underlying susceptibility. I mean, it can help with desensitizing you to that pathogen, but what about when the next one comes around, or the next one, or the next thing that triggers an immune response, or that next virus that we didn't know was coming about to the world down. You know, it's not addressing the susceptibility, the ultimate susceptibility to severe or chronic disease. So homeopathy, when it's used appropriately and when it's used in this like cures like way, that's when we actually can see people heal, get off that medication merry-go-round and get to that point where they're no longer having that susceptibility. It's very safe and it's very effective. I think that that's a really important concept to bring up as well, because as I mentioned, Samuel Hahnemann was doing a lot of his studies on very toxic things. And so we can see things that are prepared from things like heavy metals. I already mentioned biologic agents, so things that are actually, you know, pathogens can be prepared from. Very toxic plants can actually be quite helpful as very dilute homeopathic remedies. They are very safe. They are very effective. They can be taken by people who are pregnant. They can be taken by newborns. Don't have side effects in the way that you would expect side effects from something else. We'll talk a little bit about the different possible reactions to them, but they don't have lasting side effects, or they don't have things that are actually caused by the remedy specifically. Like I said, we'll talk about that in a future video. So that's my recap of what homeopathy is. The brief description about how it works is kind of focused on metaphors, because again, we're still learning the exact mechanism of action for when it binds at the cellular level. We do know there's cellular adaptation. We just don't know how that then translates to the healing of all these symptoms that we're seeing as the external manifestation of that internal imbalance, that internal susceptibility. So we use the metaphor of a nudge. Basically, homeopathy is nudging the body to move in the right direction to help it heal itself. So the healing that we see with homeopathy isn't caused by the medicine. The medicine is nudging the body to actually do the healing itself. It's getting the body so that it's repairing and able to fight things off appropriately. So it's having a correct immune response. So that it's restoring hormone balance the way that it's supposed to, restoring neurotransmitter balance, any of the things that might be seen to be off. We do see homeopathy able to shift lab values too, although we don't focus on them for our prescriptions. They do shift lab values, including white blood cell counts and titers for different infections, mold values that we see in people's tests come down using homeopathy only. So it does make tangible shifts in symptoms and on markers over time, generally not as fast as people want, but it does happen over time. The symptoms change first before the lab markers change. And we'll get to that in more detail as we talk about the homeopathic healing journey. Anything else that you want to share to wrap up here, Jody? Because I know, again, like the concept of homeopathy can be hard to wrap your head around.
I think what resonated with me and also resonates with so many moms is that with homeopathy, again, we're actually healing, you know, that root problem. And I think it's extra cool that, you know, Avery's body did all the work. All we did with homeopathy was nudge and encourage it to heal. It healed itself, which I think is really cool. And it was a nice, safe, slow process, and it's just amazing.
And because homeopathy is a gentle nudge for the body to do what it's supposed to do on its own, as Jody said, it's safe and slow and effective and gentle. So what we see improvements in how our body processes nutrients. We see improvements in how our body handles things like methylation, detoxification, immune function, sleep. We heal as a whole person because everything is connected, because homeopathy again addresses susceptibility, and susceptibility is us as a whole person, what we're susceptible to, not a specific part of our body. So we'll talk to you a little bit more about the remedies themselves, because that's a question that comes up regularly, and how they're made, how they're prescribed, all of that in our next video. So we hope we'll see you there.